As we have been reporting, President Biden held the first formal news conference of his presidency on Wednesday. The president took questions for more than an hour on a variety of topics, including the surge of unaccompanied migrant children arriving at the U.S. Mexico border, growing tensions with North Korea, Republican-led efforts to restrict voting access, as well as his future political plans. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes has the latest.
Make no apology for that.
In an hour-long exchange with reporters, President Biden defended his decision not to expel unaccompanied migrant children as their numbers in U.S. custody hit new records.
The idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, that if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump. I'm not going to do it.
The president vowed to open new facilities to cut down on overcrowding, children crammed into adult detention centers and sleeping on floors for days. He insisted the surge is seasonal as smugglers take advantage of cooler winter weather.
Does anybody suggest that there was a 31% increase under Trump because he was a nice guy and he was doing good things at the border? That's not the reason they're coming.
Mr. Biden grew most fiery on the issue of voting rights as Republican legislatures across the country pass restrictions that could disproportionately affect the very people who got him elected, minorities and young Americans.
Are you worried that if you don't manage to pass voting rights legislation, that your party is going to lose seats and possibly lose control of the House and the Senate in 2022?
What I'm worried about is how un-American this whole initiative is. It's sick. It's sick. Deciding in some states that you cannot bring water to people standing in line, waiting to vote. The Republican voters I know find this despicable. Republican voters.
He also made news on foreign policy, threatening to take action after North Korea tested 2 ballistic missiles last night.
But I'm also prepared for some form of diplomacy, but it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization.
And he cleared up one mystery about his future plans.
My plan is to run for re-election. That's my expectation.
And Nancy Cordes joins me now from the White House. Nancy, I think that that's the first time that I actually heard President Biden say that he intends to run for re-election, at least as definitively as we heard in your piece right now. Is there a reason why he's signaling that at this moment?
Probably only because I asked him about it. He may have been planning to run for re-election for quite some time, but that question hadn't been put to him, possibly because this is the first press conference that he's held of his presidency. I pointed out that at this point in his predecessor's presidency, he had already set up a re-election campaign, and President Biden joked, well, he needed one. So clearly no plans to set up his own re-election campaign right now, but he is now on the record as saying that he intends to run again and that, of course, Kamala Harris will remain his running mate.
Now on the record. All right. Well, Nancy, President Biden also in this first press conference called the situation with unaccompanied minors at the southern border, quote, unacceptable. Did he provide any more information on how his administration is working to address it?
He provided some. He said that they are working to set up new facilities to house some of these migrant children because they are really crammed into Border Patrol facilities right now that are, A, not designed for children, and B, in some cases, 1,000% over capacity with kids sleeping on the floors. He noted, for example, that Fort Bliss is being pressed into service and that there will be 5,000 beds set up at that Western Texas facility. And then he also noted that some vacant dorms at universities are going to be used to house these migrant children. But he couldn't give us any specifics about how quickly all this would happen. He said, when pressed repeatedly by one reporter, that journalists and cameras would be allowed into these facilities to see the conditions, but only after his plans to set up the facilities were in place, and he couldn't give us a timeline for how quickly that would happen.
Well, Nancy, we also heard in your piece you asking the president about voting rights legislation. This comes as Republicans in a number of state legislatures are working to pass rules which would restrict access to voting. What are the White House and congressional Democrats doing in response?
The main vehicle for their response is a voting rights bill that passed the House, but faces a very uncertain future in the Senate, where Republicans have made it very clear they don't support that bill. So I followed up with the president to ask, if you can't pass voting rights, what then? Are there things you can do on your own? He said that there are, and that he plans to do them, but that he wasn't going to lay out those plans right now. This topic is one of the main reasons why you heard so many questions, Lana, about the filibuster, because one key to getting big initiatives like this passed would be to remove this rule that says that you need 60 votes to move forward with legislation in the Senate. If the threshold was 51 votes, then perhaps something like this might have a fighting chance. And it certainly seemed as if President Biden, who just a couple of years ago was saying that it was a very dangerous move to try to get rid of the filibuster, which has been in place for decades, now seemed to be inching towards a position that would support getting rid of that rule.
Speaking of going it alone, though, Nancy, let's talk about gun control, because the president said any legislative push on that issue would come down to timing. Explain that a little bit more to our viewers, and then also, how seriously is the president considering executive action on guns?
Right. That was pretty interesting, because while he has this very full agenda that has to do with not just guns, but immigration reform and infrastructure and voting rights, he argued that good presidents have always known how to sequence their priorities, with the understanding that usually Congress can't tackle more than one big issue at a time. And he said his next big issue is infrastructure. So clearly, gun safety is going to be taking a bit of a back seat. It's not clear how long it'll take to craft the immigration legislation and what its future looks like in the House and the Senate. But it sounded as if this president, who vowed on the campaign trail to send legislation on guns to Congress on day one, is actually going to be waiting at the very least several more weeks before sending that legislation. He's also said that he would be willing to take steps via executive action, but he didn't give any details in this press conference about what those steps would be.
Well, speaking of infrastructure, I remember when you and I were speculating about what the White House's next big priority was going to be, and you nailed it. You said that you thought it was going to be infrastructure. Have we learned more about some of the items that the administration is really considering as part of this plan?
Yes, this is going to be a multi-trillion-dollar plan, Lana. It involves all the sort of traditional infrastructure initiatives that you would expect: roads and bridges and airports, shovel-ready projects, the kinds of things that the White House argues will not just stimulate the economy, but put people back to work, get them jobs as it improves the nation's infrastructure. But then they want to go beyond that, and they want to tackle broadband, for example, and what they're calling human infrastructure. Having to do with schools and jobs. And that's another huge piece of this as well, that could mean that, all told, when this plan is released, and the president does have a big speech that is scheduled for next week in Pittsburgh on this issue, we could be looking at something in the range of $3 trillion. Now, he and other Democrats have said that they think part of that should be paid for, but the way they want to pay for it, which is an increase in corporate taxes, an increase in taxes on the wealthy, is really going to land with a thud among Republicans on Capitol Hill. And just that one piece of it alone is likely to turn them off for good. So then the question becomes whether Democrats can pass some or all of this on their own without Republican help.
That'll be an interesting fight to watch, given that Republicans and Democrats support infrastructure development. But when it comes to who is paying for it and how, that's when things get pretty sticky. All right, Nancy, thank you so much.
You're welcome.